I wanted to take some time and bring forward our guest now. And our guest is Will Rose. Good afternoon, Will, and thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
It's really great to have you. And before we start peppering you with questions, obviously, I want to let our attendees know some of your background. Now, Will is currently the administrator of Fiscal Operations for the City of Newport News Engineering Department. He handles all grant reimbursements and accounting records for the Engineering Department, related to state and federally funded projects, as well as oversees the financial records of the stormwater and wastewater utility funds. He's worked at the City of Newport News Finance Office Controller. He's also been a senior auditor for the KPMG Norfolk and was a construction manager for a custom home building in Phoenix, Arizona before entering the finance field. So I can't think of anybody better to be part of this conversation about capital planning. So thank you again, Will, for doing this. Now, it's okay for folks to submit questions, and it looks like we've already had some people that have submitted questions for Will. We're going to try to get to as many of these questions as we can. And obviously, as we mentioned earlier, you can put in those questions for Will in the chat. The first question, at least I'm going to be selfish, I'm going to ask my questions first, that I have in the chat is at a high level, right? Not even considering your project management information system today. Can you explain how your capital planning works in terms of the sequence, the players and their roles, how long the process is and how often it's amended?
Yeah, sure. So like most of you, the discussions start pretty early on with a group of people. Just to give you a background, for my department, we handle all of the buildings, so the architecture group, public works, stormwater, wastewater, civil design, roads, and then the transportation projects throughout the city. So I work for the locality. You also have other players involved, which you could imagine, like Parks and Rec for building facilities or libraries, police, fire departments that want a new fire station. So all of these players get together and kind of come up with what you would like to call a needs and wants list. And so that is taken together. And then kind of what ends up happening with that is that the budget department takes a look at the list of needs and wants and then goes through and prioritizes that based upon, not to anybody's chagrin, how much money we are going to be able to borrow. So it's not limitless. So then those projects are prioritized based on the funding restrictions. And that includes other things that Jamie and Marcus talked about, grants that are available, cash that's available, as well as debt that we can take out. And so once that bottom line is set, priorities for the projects are given to a board or a council here in the City of Newport News, and then that is adopted or approved. And that timeline, we do a CIP horizon for 5 years. So essentially they adopt a 5-year plan, with the first year really being the year that we are able to implement and move forward with it. And then every year we meet again and adopt that, and it's a 5-year plan. Like most of you, though, we try to do a 10-year horizon. So whenever you have, debt goes out 20, 30 years, so you try to keep an idea and understanding of the projects that you have in the pipeline for 10 years. Some people probably do a 20-year plan, but for us, we adopt a 5-year plan, and then we have a 10-year plan of projects. And then we revisit this every year. And so this process takes, believe it or not, probably with most of you, about 8 months to get it finalized. So 4 months on discussion and back and forth and prioritizing, and then 4 months for the government body to adopt it or approve it.
Great. Thank you, Will. I appreciate it. How was this managed before you implemented a project management information system? And what were the challenges associated with that?
Well, I guess like 70% of our users on the poll this morning, we were using Excel spreadsheets, which obviously presents its own issues. And so, a few of those things, the challenges, I think one of the biggest ones for myself when I took over this position was that, like most of you, we have maybe hundreds. I think we have 300 total projects in Projectmates. And it's very difficult to not only track the dollars, but also be able to explain in narrative form what's going on with the project, what its priorities are, what the value, the score of the project will be, like you've seen in the rankings. And so that gets lost when you're trying to say, hey, we need a sewer project, because a sewer project is just another pipe on a job. It's to somebody else who's making a decision. But if you have, the reasons why that's available, the narrative that goes in to that Excel sheet, which doesn't have the capability to explain why that project is important, that it really gets lost in Excel spreadsheets. The other, and probably the most important one that people complain about, is just the sharing of information across multiple people. You can see the players that we had involved and who's editing. It's one thing to lock in cells and say nobody can edit. It's a read-only document. But I mean, what are you really leveraging and sharing and discussing if everything's locked out, or if things are changing and it's a wild, wild west out there? So those were the challenges when I first got here, and how we tried to meander around those.
If I could peel back the onion just a little bit on one of those statements that you just made, in terms of sharing information. So in a typical year, how many people are you keeping in the loop about the capital plan that potentially you were sharing with showing an Excel spreadsheet, just out of curiosity?
Probably hundreds. I mean, when you look at a city management group of 10 people, a fire department and the multiple chiefs, and a police department and the multiple infrastructure chiefs they have, and not just our group of engineers and project managers, estimators, communication people who are trying to communicate, how we're doing it. So the list just goes on and on. Pretty expansive process. Financial and budget people to keep an idea on how much money we're thinking about borrowing.
Oh yeah. Wow. So I guess the next question I would have then is, what is the change that obviously, how are you managing this process in your current project management system? And what has been the positive outcomes, but also have you had any trade-offs that you've had to make?
I think the really important part, and you guys kind of discussed it in managing the process, is that we're able to, with the project management information system that we have, you have a good starting point on the discussion. And I think a lot of my background's in accounting. So when you're meeting with individuals, whether it be engineers, a budget department, a finance group, or fire, it could be somebody as simple as a fire department. It's nice to start off your discussion looking at one system and one set of results to lead the discussion. I think we've all been in meetings before where the budget department brings a different set of records to discuss, and the finance department looks at it with all of the accounting rules and accruals, those funny things that we can't explain to other people, contingencies, and things of that nature. And the project managers sometimes just look at things in terms of actual costs, and don't equate things like overhead and other things that other people are including in project costs. And so I think one of the biggest things that you can leverage from the system is when you sit down to discuss it, it's in a shared group, and we're all looking at the same funding, same numbers, and we're not discussing, well, where did this source come from and how did that happen? We all start at a start point, and that really helps lead the discussion. Kind of cuts through and is able to kind of look at, okay, where are we headed, and what do we need to do to help this project move along, and what are the priorities? And so I'd say that that's been one of the better parts of managing the process and been a positive outcome.
So from a trade-off perspective, have you seen any like difficult trade-offs that you had to make by changing to more of a web-based standardized project management process rather than an Excel spreadsheet?
The only one that kind of comes to mind, and you guys touched on it earlier, was, like any system you have, sometimes you have, when you guys are showing like debiting and crediting the fund, things change and move. So when things change and move, you're updating in the capital planning based on moving budgets over, projects run a little overboard, so where's that money going to come from? So you're doing a little bit of, back and forth in the system. if you haven't integrated your system to account for that, where you guys are using the integrated software to take stuff from Projectmates and put it in the financial system, then that problem is solved. For some organizations, I could see where the kind of like the double accounting, they call it. You're doing it in one system and then in the other system. So I could see initially that might be a trade-off. But for us, we haven't had that issue. The trade-off from the Excel sheet that we just discussed greatly outweighs anything from that minor activity.
Right. Yeah, and I appreciate you answering that question, because sometimes it's helpful to, I don't know, I call it warts and all, right? What are the positives and negatives of doing something different? There's always some sort of advantage and disadvantage of doing things a certain way over another. So I appreciate the information on that. So I guess the next question I have is, in terms of transitioning, obviously when you came on board, transitioning from your former process to this new process in your project management information system, what was the biggest challenge in terms of that transition, and how did you overcome it?
So to be honest with you, as you guys said, you guys really, you use the KISS method when you develop the process. I thought one of the most difficult things was going to be for somebody trying to implement it would be all list of the projects. I think I told you we had 300 some projects that we had to essentially put into capital planning, but the import feature and export feature really worked really nicely to just seamlessly import all of our projects and narratives. And so that was time saved, time well spent. There really wasn't anything difficult to have to overcome. I mean, setting up the funds might seem like a process at first to have to go in and list all of your funds, but I think it was one of the best things we did, because going through what you guys went through with the funding, you outlined how many different sources you can have with a project. And so putting that level of detail in has been, immense in our reporting. That used to be kind of an unknown. How many grants do we have with this specific grant that we are currently funding? That can be found in seconds, as opposed to going back through and pulling that stuff out, arduously through a financial database system. So it really wasn't that difficult.
Awesome. So I guess the next question I have is, what was the city's experience looping in various departments to leverage the CIP tool?
So I kind of touched on this earlier. I guess part of the process was just being able to sit down and share information, starting from a starting point, looking at from a Parks and Rec, an architect, and all looking at the same database and the same information, and having everything linked in there so that we could discuss a project basically in its entirety, and everybody had an understanding on what we were looking at. We weren't confused with different projects. If you're using an Excel sheet or what the funding is, it's all contained in the system. And I think that really just, it starts the conversation and you're just more efficient in where you're headed. Instead of maybe backtracking, trying to figure out, those little pieces of where it's funded from, you kind of start on the project itself and look at the future instead of going backwards. I think it's a lot of times where our discussions were. They were on what happened in the past. Unfortunately, we're meeting to talk about the capital planning in the future. So that was how we leveraged it. And I kind of, spoke to the different groups. Everybody in our organization, we employ about 2,500 people, and everybody, key players in all organizations have access to Projectmates. And so to have those projects listed and share the information with them.
So, obviously you had several years using a project management information system in terms of your kind of length of it. And obviously organizations are always making tweaks or changes in terms of their processes. Are there obviously any additional changes or other changes that you want to make or thinking about implementing within either your program or your program management system?
I think one of the important things that Jamie showed in her demo was the ability to take a contract and link that to your capital planning piece to show what you've encumbered. I think originally when I first started using Projectmates, the city wasn't utilizing that option. And so over time it became, the understanding was we were needing reports to be run on where are we at with this project. It's in the design phase, and how much more money do we have coming in, and what have we encumbered as of today, and what's the last leg of the funding. In a financial system, you're more or less looking at what you have today and what you've approved today. It doesn't look at what's out in the future. So like most people, if you use an Excel spreadsheet, you have to combine the financial data and the Excel spreadsheet to get your picture. The capital planning piece is not also planning the phases of your funding, it's also pulling in those contracts and encumbrances and actuals, and helps you give you a better picture of what you have moving forward. I think one of the things that we learned that's really helped out, became obvious during COVID, when we were looking at resetting the deck on priorities for projects, we were actually able to run some of those reports and look at what we had out there and what we needed to finish up, in essence, what our priorities were. So I think that's one of the things that we implemented, but it didn't start until like 2021, 2022. So it's been a great feature going forward that we weren't utilizing beforehand.
And that's a great point. And I think you also mentioned this, Will, and I think this is super important in terms of keeping it simple, right? So where you start is not necessarily where you finish, right? So it's always a question of bringing on processes incrementally that make positive changes and then building off of that success. I think that's also a key component, at least in my opinion, of implementing any type of centralized structural component that you're managing a large amount of data. A lot of times, at least in my experience, some customers or some people try to do too much of a big bang, and they end up just completely stressing themselves out, and it's not as useful as it could be. So that's always a key component to think about. So I guess, what are your biggest takeaways, right? So, let's pretend that there's others on this webinar that are, considering something like this path. What would your advice be to some of those people? Is there anything that you feel like they should know based off of your experiences in this?
I think one of the biggest things that, maybe it's selfish of me, but I think one of the nicest things about the system is that, your project managers actually have clarity on the funding of the project that they're managing. I think a lot of us from time to time, like it's in the finance world, we're constantly interrupted with questions about budgets, changes to contracts, change orders, asking if we have enough money available, what's the status of this and that. And a lot of that, interrupts, your day to have to explain that. And when you have multiple projects in Projectmates, you have to stop and research it because you don't want to give a wrong answer. Whereas I think the biggest takeaway that I've had from it is that once we arm the project managers with their budget in the capital planning section, the plan budget, they're actually able to go pull that information and know that, oh, I can afford an $8,000 change order for a fiber relocation for my project, and I don't have to bother the financial resource team to get that answer or slow it down. I can move forward with that in mind and proceed. So I think if you're considering it, I think it's going to make your life easier in the long run, and it's going to arm your project managers with some decision making. That's going to help them along the way as well. It's very easy to get implemented. I think that's the other key about this. And one other thing I kind of didn't talk about on the other some of the other questions that just came to me. I think when Jamie was demoing, when she was showing you that you can set up different phases, this is important, phases in the funding. On an Excel spreadsheet, you don't show how much you have allocated for construction or right-of-way or design. And that brings a bit more clarity to your project managers to tie it back in, to show them what the different phases are and how the budget's broken down. Excel spreadsheets can't do that. I can't tell you how many times when you're building sometimes a complicated project like a school, sometimes people have forgotten IT equipment. You can make a line that shows IT equipment or furniture. Who's paying for the furniture? Are the schools paying for it, or is it our responsibility? As Marcus showed, you can make it as detailed as you need, or as granular as you need. And so that really does help provide more clarity to everyone for discussion points, as well as saving you time, as I get back to it being kind of selfish. Do we have money in the budget for furniture? Well, I don't know. I haven't read the contract, but it's in capital planning right there, furniture.
Right, right. And I guess another question I have for you, and this is really a lot of it's based off some of the questions that we're getting here is, how are you using historical information from your capital planning to influence your future projects? I know you touched on that a little bit, but maybe you can expand or answer that particular question for the folks that are on the call.
That's a good question. It was a lot easier to historically research and say how much did it cost to build a pump station, because we could use some of the same parameters. I could run a report and see how many pump stations we built in the last 3 years. But like a lot of people on the call, we're seeing so much escalation in labor costs and material costs that historical information has lately been kind of a bummer. But we'll return to the days, I'm sure, when you'll be able to look at past projects and be able to pull information from that and lessons learned, as I just discussed with some of the other setting up of furniture costs and IT equipment costs, just so you have an earmark for that stuff, and you'll be able to run reports and see.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that's really an important piece too, right? You can only take you so far if the world has gone crazy a little bit, right? So, I know we only have a couple of minutes left, and I do want to get at least one more question from customers. One of them had asked her in terms of, at least for your organization, what kind of enterprise system are you using for your actuals? And then another question is related to that. How many different funds are actually in your CIP? If just a rough estimate.
Oh, okay. So we're currently using Munis. That's a Tyler Technologies program. It's one of the bigger ones out there. It's based out of Maine. It's a really simple system. That's what we're using. Funds. That's another good question. I believe we have 40 different funds in the fund program, and that's because we have so many grants we currently reside in Virginia, and so the Virginia Department of Transportation likes to differentiate things with different grants, but it's very helpful to have all those different grants listed, so I can tell them at any moment how many projects we have going on with congestion mitigation, air quality grants versus rail transport, pedestrian safety grants. So many or as less as you need.